So yeah, it seems like half of the questions on answers nowadays are associated with AGVs, and a lot of people are using the AGV process flow template. The problem is the AGV process flow template was kind of intended to be kind of a launching point for people to essentially kind of, here's some stuff that you can use, and it has a lot of features itself, but it was never intended to kind of be the end all be all of any AGV model. The problem is I think a lot of people, when they get to the point where they need to adjust it, it's so complicated that they're kind of intimidated and saying, well, if I change this, then what's that going to do? Is it going to break everything? And so I think a lot of people they like the AGV process flow template, but at the same time, I think there's a little bit of fear associated with it. So I decided for the next release that instead of having a single AGV process flow template, we would have multiple different ones that progressively increase in their complexity and feature set. So the idea would be is you could start out with a very simple process flow, and one, it can make it easier to understand what's happening, but also if it's a lot simpler, then it makes it so that you can you can master it a lot quicker, and you can more easily adjust. I guess by the fact that you've mastered it, you will hopefully have more confidence in being able to adjust it and make it customized to what you need. So I just set up a basic setup, basic loop of AGVs here. And so if you go to the process flow menu and add an object process flow. So now instead of one AGV process flow template, there are 5, and each one of them progressively increases in its complexity. The basic AGV is about as simple as you can get. So I'm going to take you through and kind of explain in detail what each one of these does. And hopefully as I go through, you can kind of see, see better and understand and master the process flow template a little bit better. So I'm going to add the basic AGV. And so this is what it is. The other thing that I've done is I've taken out all of the documentation pieces and pictures, because I figure that might also be a little bit of an intimidation factor, just seeing a bunch of text. And so instead of that, I just have this one text that says, look at this, to get more information on this process flow template, look at this user manual topic, okay? And then you can go to the user manual topic and it'll explain each of them in detail. Okay, so once you add the basic AGV process flow template, then I go in and say attach that AGV to, or that process flow to each of the AGVs. I'm just going to reset and run and kind of step through what is happening here. First, so you have some initial things happening, but for each one of these AGVs, so I have 2 AGVs attached to it. You can see the 2 AGVs attached to it. Each one of them will start, and I'll get to that point, to this point a little bit later on, but just want to step in. Okay, so the next thing that happens is at some point, when an item arrives in a queue, what I've configured the queues to do is, this is essentially how you plug into the AGV process flow, is when you use a transport, you use the option use list, push to item list, no task sequence, okay? And in there, you push to the AGV work list, okay? So if I go into my toolbox, you'll see that there's this AGV work list. And if I look at the entries, I'll look at the entries in the back orders. Okay, let's see. I'm just gonna step through again. Okay. So at this point, an item has arrived and that item has been pushed onto the list. Wait a minute, I guess I went too fast. Okay, so this is the work generation section. And the main thing with this section is you have one token that essentially listens for things being pushed onto this AGV work list. Okay, and so you can see this is the back order here, where it's just saying, when anything pushes something onto this AGV work list, I want to pull it off. Okay, so then when an item arrives and pushes it on, let's see. Okay, so now an item has arrived. This guy has popped out, and then he immediately goes back to pulling it. But then he spawned the separate process. The separate process is essentially just looking at the queue that the item is in, and then it's figuring out the control point that is associated with that queue. And then what it does is it assigns that and then pushes the item back onto the list, but it's in a partition associated with that control point. Okay, so now I have this box and it's on a partition of that list that is associated with control point 33. The reason that I do that is that when a guy arrives at that control point, then he can just pull from this list and say, hey, is there something to pick up here? Okay, so this partitioning system right here is essentially the same across all of the, well, similar across all of the process flows. The idea is you pull off from the AGV work list, you figure out where that item is, and then you push back onto the list onto a partition of that list, right? So that people, when they arrive, they can pull from that partition, they can know what work is associated with that specific location. Okay, so that's kind of the work generation section. The other part is the main AGV loop. The main AGV loop is essentially just going to send the AGV around in a loop and then look for work at the given spots. Okay, so what I need to do here is I need to create that loop. So I'll go ahead and create it. So I create an A connect from here. The other thing is, from the previous version, I've changed the names of the connections so that they'll hopefully be more intuitive. Instead of next look for work, I use the connection next, I name the connection next work point. And so instead of calling them look for work points, I'm just calling them work points. So you say next work point, and then you also have this, what used to be a look for work connection, I'm now calling work forwarding, which is hopefully more intuitive, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But I essentially create this loop. All right, so now I've got this loop. Now what each one of the AGVs is going to do, it's going to start up, and then it's going to say, assuming that I am at this point, see if there is anything on this AGV work list associated with this point. So pull from that partition. If it doesn't see anything, then what it does is it says, get the next work point. This is a pull from list, and it's pulling from the next work point list. This is actually a partitioned list that's kind of an automatic feature of the AGV system, where you can make your connections into a partitioned list. So if I look at this list here, next work point, I can view the entries. You see it's a bunch of partitions, and this guy is pulling from, so in this case, this is, let's see. This guy that he's currently on is control point 9, right? So if I run, if you look at control point 9's partition, which is right here, so it's essentially this guy, once he finds that there's no work to do, he's going to pull from this partition of the list, okay? And this partition has one entry, which is control point 38, which is this one, right? So he pulls that off and he sees, okay, the next control point I can look at is control point 38. And then he pulls it off the list, and then he immediately puts it back onto the list. And then he travels to that next work point. Once he's traveled to that next work point, he just loops around and does the whole thing again. Okay, so he arrives here, he travels to that work point. Once he arrives at that work point, he'll bump through again, get the next work point, and continue to travel. Now this guy, this AGV, he's going to travel here, and he's going to see that there is an item there, right? So if I step, okay, so now this is AG1, he's breathing. Now he's going to say, is there an item to load at this point? And he's pulling from this list, from this partition, which is control point 33. He will find that box, and so then he's going to jump out of that loop into the load loop, which is once I found that box and he's pulled it off of the item, and you can look on this token and you can see that the item is that specific box. Now he just loads the item, he travels to the destination, okay, so whatever the destination has been assigned for that item, and then he unloads the item, right? And then once he's unloaded the item, let's see if he, okay, it should be maybe next one. So now he unloads the item, he breathes, and then he jumps back into the main loop, which is, okay, now I'm here. Is there something to load here? And then he gets back into the main loop, right? So there's nothing to load here. So then he'll jump in and say, okay, what's the next work point? Get it off of the list and then put it back onto the list. And then move to that location. So this is essentially the most basic implementation of the AGV process flow. It's just looping around, seeing stuff that's happening. One thing that might be interesting is, you'll notice that I actually pull it off the list when I'm looping for the next work point. I pull it off the list and then I put it back onto the list. So the reason that I implemented it that way was in case you have branches in your loop. Okay. So if I run it now, you should be able to see for this partition, control point 9, I actually have 2 entries. Okay. So by the fact that I have 2 entries, there are 2 options. It's a branch in my loop. So how do I make sure that people go to both branches? What I do is I pull it off the list. So when it first starts out, he'll pull control point 8 off of the list, and then control point 38 will go to the top of the list, and then he'll push control point 8 back onto the list. So it will be at the end of the list. So the next guy who comes through will then pick the next guy. So by doing it this way, I've essentially created a round robin effect, so that when a guy gets here and needs to go to the next work point, the first guy who arrives will go to this one, and the second guy who arrives will go to this one, right? So if you see, and I may not actually see it because everybody's loaded. Let's change this to be wider, longer. So that guy he goes to the further one, right? Because he's the second guy through, right? So that's just one way I decided to do it. If you have branches in your loop, it'll do a round robin. There's other ways you could, do some type of a management of how much work is on this loop, how much, this other loop, and how much work is on, essentially compare the number of the set of work in the different branches of the loop. And you can do that. Yeah, go ahead.
Are those two options going around the loop, are they required for some logic to work, or are they just yet one more example within this basic AGV template? I don't understand. Did you just want to demonstrate this round robin selection of inside loop, outside loop, or was it?
Yeah, when I implemented it, I just wanted to be able to support branches in the loop, right?
And this was the easiest way to set that up and demonstrate it.
Okay. Yeah, because I guess you could have also done something like, just an assign labels. And when you assign a label, you just say agv.connections current next work point of 1, right? So what this would, right? So I decided to use a list instead of just accessing the connection, right? Because if I access the connection, then it disables the ability to have branches in your loop, right? But you could do it this way. If there's no branches in your loop, then it might be simpler to just have, an assign labels that gets the next guy in the loop instead of pulling from a list and then putting back onto a list, right? So, yeah, it was just a choice that I made. I wanted in this basic one to be able to support branches in your next work point loop. So
I think Cliff is also asking why you have those extra loops on the end, and that's because you're going to show some other stuff with that later.
Yeah, well,
that's what I was asking.
This specifically isn't probably a good example, right? It's just making the guy go longer, right? But it may be that in a real situation, you have one loop that then maybe branches off, or when you get to a certain point, you may actually go, sometimes you go over here from that point, and sometimes you go over here to look for work, right? So you may decide differently based upon certain things, saying, okay, here, instead of just one next point to go to, you may go, there may be a completely different area that you want to kind of branch off to, right? So in this case, this is just a very simplistic, right, looping scenario. If I had a much bigger system, I might have a branch in my work point loop, that branches off to larger, sub loops or whatever. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So yeah, in this case, I don't know why I would ever do this unless there was actually work right here that I might want to look at, right? Okay. All right. Any other questions at this point before I move on? Okay. So advantages of this is obviously it's really simple, to set up. There's just one connection type that you use. Some disadvantages, for example, is if you always have something in this queue, when a guy comes around, if there's if there's tons of stuff being thrown onto this queue, then this queue could be starved, right? Because an AGV is going to come around and he's going to look at this, this work point, and if there's something to do there, he's always going to do it. And so if there's always something to do here, then he'll never actually get here to pick something up, right? What you can do to alleviate that, and that's where the more complex, so the next phase comes in, instead of the basic AGV, I'm going to move to the AGV. I'm going to use the AGV with work forwarding. Okay. And I'm going to delete this one, delete the first one. And then I'm going to connect these guys up to that one. Process flow AGV2. Okay. So AGV with work forwarding does the exact same thing. So if you look here, it almost looks, this part looks exactly the same, except here, I've added a little section here that does work forwarding, okay? Now in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, so in this work point loop, each one of these control points is what you would call a work point, right? Because it's one of the things in the work point loop. So instead of setting it up like that, I am going to, instead of having a million work points, I'm just going to have 2 work points. Okay, and I'm going to have one work point be this guy and one work point be this guy. Okay, so I'm going to connect from this work point to this work point and say that is my next work point, and then I'm going to connect from this work point to this work point and say that's my next work point. So essentially they're just going from here to here and back again. Okay, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to forward my work to one of those work points. Okay, so I connect from this control point to this control point, and I say work forwarding. From this control point to this control point, work forwarding. And from this control point to this control point, and work forwarding. Okay.
So it matters which direction you click drag? Yes,
it does.
Then it makes sense going the way you went, though. Forwarding seems backwards.
Well, I'm forwarding the work from here to this work point, right?
Oh, think of it from that. Okay.
Right. So, yeah. So the partition, right? Remember, we're pulling from a partition of a list. And what I'm essentially doing here is I'm decreasing the number of partitions to be just 2 partitions. Okay. And so in order to forward the work, I'm forwarding the work from being here to here so that the item that arrives here gets on this guy's partition. Okay. So when I arrive at that control point, if there are items in both of these guys, then I will have a single partition that I can pull from that can see multiple items.
That makes sense.
And so then when I get here, from that point, I can see both of these work things. And by default, it's, well, let's see, what is the thing? By default, it is, there's no query, which means it'll be first come, first served, right? The first guy that pushes onto that partition will be the first one to be pulled off, right? But you can also do other queries as you're looking for items to load, right? So I forward to that work, and if I reset and run now, so now they should be just looping between, and notice he skips over that because the partition is here. But this guy should be able to see it. He'll then be assigned to it. He'll travel to that location, load the item, and travel. Okay. Yeah, so I can see if I look at, view the entries on this guy, when the item arrives, you should be able to see this box that is in Q36. It's in the partition that is associated with control point 10, right? Because I have forwarded that work to control point 10. Yeah, so both of those guys would forward it to it. So in the work forwarding, there are 3 different possibilities. for the work forwarding connection. So this is kind of what this thing is. One is if a given control point, and I'm talking about this control point, if it has no work forwarding connections, so I'm here, then it essentially pushes it onto this control points. It works like it did before. It pushes onto this control points partition. So if that is the case, then that control point needs to be part of the work point loop, okay? If it has one connection, right, so right here, then it'll just it'll push it onto this partition. The other option is you can technically have more than one work forwarding connection, okay? So for example, I could say that that this AGV can also have a work forwarding connection. No, what's a good one? Yeah, so this control point can have a work forwarding connection to here. Okay. So if there is more than one work forwarding connection, then it will push that item onto the partition of both of them. And then when one of them is pulled off, it'll remove it from the other partitions. So what that means is work that is at this location is technically visible to both this AGV and to this AGV. So whoever gets there first and pulls it off first will be able to grab it, right? So the work forwarding connection gives you a lot of flexibility in saying where you want to, where AGVs can see what work. You just, set up the work forwarding connection to one or more different areas, and then the AGVs will then recognize that work when they arrive there.
Anthony, how would you set up the situation where you want to have the AGVs just have one point where they look at all queues? For instance, the AGV 1 wants to make a decision based on all three of the queues.
Yeah.
Would you just move that?
Yeah. If you want them to go here, then you can just have a work forwarding connection to right there. Right. So then this control point, you don't need
that other, I don't know what number it is, the one over by AGV 2 there, that control point.
I guess the thing is, if you're doing it that way, I guess if you're doing it that way, then
you got to tell them somewhere to go. So you'd probably have to move that control point just to the side of the other control point, but they have to take the whole loop around to get there.
I guess part of me wonders, like, why not just use a dispatcher in that case?
Oh, well.
The whole idea of the AGV, the AGV process template process flow is like the work is dispatched based upon location, right? So if it's all one location, then I don't know that there's a huge, but I could set it up. I could set it up anyway, right? So you could do something like, let's get rid of this. Yeah, so if you have everything forwards its work to this control point, and then you just have after I am finished unloading, I always go back to that control point, right? So I say next work point here, next work point here, and next work point here. Okay, so technically I haven't set up a loop, right? Because it's not really a loop, but when I get here, this is where all of the work needs to be. Now, here's the other thing that you need to change is right now it just checks for 0 time, right? It tries to see if there is a load at your location, and if there is not a load, then it jumps out, right, and moves on and finds the next work point. So what you would need to do is you change this to say, well, if I get back here, I'm just going to wait infinitely until I can get a load at this point, okay? And then the next thing, the other thing that you need to change is once you get done unloading, right, because I'm unloading here, once I get done unloading, then I always need to get back to this point, right? Because I'm waiting forever, then, you know, once I'm done unloading, I could wait forever right here.
That's a design decision, though. I mean,
Yeah.
there could be some systems where
just
they're
the way
just
that
going
you might
around and around in a circle the whole time, even if there's nothing to do.
Yeah. Yeah. So if I do it this way, right, then essentially everybody should, let's see. And both of my guys, I need to reset them so that both of them are set up here at that work point as their reset point, right? Okay, because when they jump into the simulation, they're going to immediately look for work at the point where they're at, right? And they're going to wait forever. So I don't want him here because he's going to wait forever here. So I need to set him up there. Okay, so if then I do it that way,
Very good. And that helps explain to me some of those other things you were talking about. Seems very
so he'll go to that spot and then just wait, right, forever until the next item arrives, right? So again, yeah, like the process flow is meant to be a starting point, right? And it's meant for you to be able to edit it and make adjustments as needed.
Yeah.
Right.
You still need to document this, right? But it'll be documented for 2021.
It is. Well, I have documented it now. Yeah. So if you go into
not in the, I was just looking for it. It looks the same
in the beta, in the latest beta.
Well, I got the beta.
I feel like even in the latest beta, help man, like, can you open the without downloading the help manual? So we posted it online, right?
Oh, that's
or do you have to download the beta help manual?
Yeah, I don't know if we've pushed 21.1 documentation to docs.
Yeah, it's not on docs yet.
Yeah, so I've gone through and I've talked about each one of these.
We should probably push that documentation.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially
so this goes through basic AGV with work forwarding. Yeah. So it goes through each one of them and shows you what each one of them does. So
I think that was smart of you to take it out of the window itself.
Yeah, it makes it a lot simpler to kind of see the logic instead of having a whole wall of text.
Yeah.
So kind of going along with Cliff's questions about how would I handle various situations, one of the most helpful things I've ever done was to remake that AGV template just from scratch and like look at every activity. And I'd say doing that even with just this basic one kind of helps you understand the tornado of features that Anthony has used to kind of put this all together, right? You've got 3D objects pushing the list, you've got process flow instances, you've got travel tasks, right? You've got list round robin kind of default behavior just because of the way push and pull works. I would say that it's a worthwhile activity to kind of like make sure you understand each of the components, and even stuff like AGV control point connections, that those are like a feature of our software outside the templates, and Anthony just happens to use them, things like that.
Yeah.
And
well,
so
if anyone decides to do that, make a video of it.
I think you did, right? You did, Jordan, right?
I did that, and I made a video a while back.
Did it ever get out there?
It's
I think it's an internal video, right?
It's even worse than an uncut video because I recorded it once, and then I realized my mic had been off the whole time. So then I recorded it, I took a giant screen capture again. But yeah, just like being able to, I don't know, kind of grasp the combination of features that Anthony used. Since then, I've often made my own kind of AGV template for situations that I felt like it would just be simpler and easier to just make my own. But but it's just really nice to be able to have these examples and to work
we
from
have
them.
this little video today, so this will be a starter for people, plus the documentation he has.
Yeah.
But that's a good tip to rebuild it from scratch.
Okay, I'm going to spend a little bit more time with the next one, and then I'll just talk. Yeah, so I'm trying to send it back to what it was, to the original one. Actually, I'm going to delete this so I can take that.
Yeah, maybe demo like, hey, I might have messed up my flow and I want to start over, right? So you can just delete it, re-add it.
So I can go in, so I'm going to move to the next one. The next one is AGV with basic parking. Okay. So this one is similar, except that work generation is exactly the same. Loading and unloading are different. I guess I add two features on this one from the previous one. One is you can load multiple items if you have set the capacity of the object to greater than 1. And 2, it can do what I call basic parking. So let me show you. So I'm going to connect a parking spot here. So I'm going to create this connection to a park point with a park point. And then from here, I'm going to create a connection with a park point. So, you say, well, first of all, it adds in, by the fact that it can load multiple ones, I have to add something into the control loop that says, if I've already unloaded stuff, or if I've already loaded stuff, when I arrive at a work point, is there something that I need to unload here, right? So it asks the question, when I arrive at a work point, do I have an item that I've loaded that I can unload here, right? The other thing is when you load an item, instead of immediately unloading the item, it just pushes that item onto a list that is your set of currently loaded items, okay? And then it will, if you have more capacity, it will jump back into the loop. If you have reached your capacity, then it will jump into the unload portion. And when it jumps into the unload portion, it gets from the loaded items, it says, hey, what are the set of, what's the best loaded item that I can unload now? Okay. And then it'll unload. And then, yeah. The other thing that it adds is when it gets to a parking spot, or when it gets to a work point and it can't unload and it can't load anything there, then it says, okay, if I'm empty, then can I park? So if it's already loaded an item, it can't park. But if I am empty, if it is empty, then it'll see if there is a parking spot. So again, it uses that same feature. It pulls from a partition of a list that is associated with that park points connection. So when I'm here, it'll see, is there an available parking spot? And if it gets a parking spot, then it will automatically go and park there. When it parks there, it will then pull from the list, the same list, that AGV work list, and it will wait. It will pull from the list associated with that work point, and it'll wait until it gets something from that work point. Okay. So I'm gonna run. Let's see how this works. Oh, whoops. Oh yeah, I need to connect them. So process flow, AGV, I attach it to that AGV process flow. Okay, notice when you first get in, it jumps in here. It doesn't find anything to unload. It doesn't find any to load. It is empty, and it finds a parking spot. So it goes ahead and parks. So it's now traveling to the park point. And then each of these is just waiting, is pulling for that load. So this guy is going to look, it's going to wait for stuff to arrive associated with this control point. So based upon how you've done your work forwarding, it will be activated based upon who you have forwarded to that work point, right? So these three are, I guess all three of them are forwarding to this point. So technically when this guy is parked, he will be visible, or all items will be visible to him. Whereas for this guy, oh, whoops, I guess I have not, I guess, probably need to do the right connections here. Let's see. Okay, so this guy forwards to both locations. I'm going to disconnect that. And then I am going to connect there. Okay, so this guy, I'll just make it simple work forwarding. So this guy forwards to that location, and this guy forwards to this location. So anything over here is visible to this guy. Anything over here is visible to this guy. So they'll park, you know, anything that arrives here will be seen by the guy who is parked here. And I need to connect up my next look for work point. So when I get here, I need to connect up my next work point. Whoops. Let's see. So that I can get back to the work loop. And then when I unload here, my next work point is here. And so anything that arrives in this queue will activate this AGV. Anything that arrives in these two queues will activate that AGV. The key with this one is it's a very simple parking, right? If it doesn't find something to do and there's a parking spot, then it will always go to that parking spot. And it will always wait until something is found, you know, there is work at that point where he is parked. So you do have to be a little bit careful about how you distribute, how you do your work forwarding, and how many guys can park in certain areas. Because if everybody can park in one area and you don't forward your work to that one area, then you may have a bunch of people parked and then an item that needs to be worked on that nobody can see, right? But that's, you know, that's just the way that you could do it. You know, you could say, and this may happen in real life where you distribute your AGVs. You have one or two parking spots at lots of different locations such that when they park, they automatically distribute themselves. And then when they get activated, they are activated, the guys who are closest to that spot are activated based upon how you do your work forwarding, right? All right. So that's the work forwarding one. Any questions at this point? Okay, I'm not going to actually build the other ones. I'm just going to go through each one of them.
I have a question, Anthony.
Yeah.
Is there a reason why you use so many L's and U's?
I think L was meant to be jump into loading. Jump into the loading portion, and U was meant as an unload connection. Yeah, that was the main reason. And then P is a parking connection. So yeah, the main reason was they're associated, L is associated with a loading and U is associated with an unloading.
You may want to color those. I don't know.
Yeah.
Just to help you link
Can
them.
we number them like L1, L2?
That would work too.
Yeah. Well, I always figure you can just click on it and see what the connection is. But
yeah,
maybe that is something.
Seems a little weird from a flow chart perspective to have like 4 places where U's are going into different things.
Yeah.
And 3 places where L's are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe that's right. Maybe that's true.
Just a thought. I was just wondering what your reasoning was.
You're going to have to change those screenshots, unfortunately, but I think it's a good idea, Anthony.
Yeah.
You've done such a good job up to here to make it
Yeah.
simpler. Better go that extra step.
Okay, the other one is AGV with heuristic parking. This is where it actually gets pretty complicated. It's a lot. There's a lot more stuff. The two things that AGV with heuristic parking adds above the other one is, instead of just always parking at the location, it does this heuristic balancing thing where it calculates the amount of the total AGV capacity, which is the sum of all of the active AGV's capacities, right? And then it compares it to the number of active items, meaning the items that need to be moved that have not yet been unloaded. And when it gets to a parking spot or a work point and it sees a parking location, it will do a balancing heuristic where it says, well, if the number of AGV capacity, the total AGV capacity minus my capacity is still greater than or equal to the total number of outstanding items, then I can go ahead and park. If it's less than, then I can't park. And then it also does it when it activates. Whenever you activate an AGV, or at least whenever new work arrives, it does that balancing and says, well, if with this new work, are the number of active AGVs out there, or active AGV capacity out there, is it now less than the amount of work? And if so, then I need to activate an AGV. So that's kind of, there's a lot of stuff going on here that's just associated with kind of managing those two numbers. But for the most part, the work generation is essentially the same, other than a little bit of tracking and seeing if you need to activate an AGV. Trying to think, what was the other one, the other feature that this
Anthony,
one adds? Yeah.
Anthony,
Oh, it also, yeah.
Do you have battery? It looks like you have battery charging in there, right?
Yeah, that's the other feature that it adds, is it does a default battery tracking, but I don't feel like this should be something that you use out of the box. It's just as an initial idea, because it assumes that every parking spot is a recharge location, which I don't think is true in real life. And so perhaps perhaps we should change that, or at this point, this should just be seen as, here's a starting point. You can try it. I would say if you're going to do real battery capacity or battery tracking, then use a new connection. Instead of the park points connection, you would use a recharge point connection. And then you query that when your battery is below a certain threshold. And then you go to a recharge location. Yeah.
Well, you did a good job of explaining that in the help. I just looked, and so I think it's fine to leave it as is. It's good to have it be a simple introduction.
Yeah, yeah. So those are the two things that this one adds, and then you have the advanced. I didn't know exactly how to name this, but I just said advanced, which is the big kahuna, which has all of the features. The main one that this adds above heuristic parking is it adds pickup points and drop-off points. So drop-off points are, when you arrive at the destination unload point, you can have these drop-off points connections where at that point, it will dynamically find an available drop-off point. So if you have multiple different slots that are technically at the same unload point, right, and you want to find an available slot, then you can use the drop-off points connection. And then pickup points, if it's a work point, you can have multiple pickup points connections off of your work point that then it figures out whenever an item arrives, it figures out kind of an available slot to put it in for loading.
So is this one basically the old EGV?
Yeah, this is the big kahuna, what the old one was. I have changed this one and the heuristic parking so that it calculates total AGV capacity when it's talking about the heuristic for parking. It calculates total AGV capacity instead of total number of AGVs, right? So, and that makes it work better for multi-capacity AGVs. So if I have 10 AGVs that are active and each of them can load 2 items at a time, then my total AGV capacity is 20. So it does that. This one does this calculation, whereas the old template process flow just counted 10 AGVs, which would mess things up in your parking heuristic if you have more than if you have multi AGV capacity. So that's really the only change that has been made from the old process flow to this one. All right, well, that's all I got.